Every throne has a price. History only tells you who sat on it. In Japan, there is a famous philosophy for handling an impossible obstacle, symbolized by a bird that refuses to sing. It is a mirror for the absolute limits of human power. Because when life hands you something that completely refuses to yield to your will, your psychology defaults to three extreme responses. You kill it. You seduce it. You wait for it. But it never mentions the price. Long before they inspired the legendary blood-soaked power struggles of modern fiction like Shogun, these three men faced the exact same silent bird. Only one of them got to hear Japan sing, and the price each one paid to get there will tell you everything about who you actually are. How does an elite mind respond when they are completely, unapologetically outgunned? Imagine standing on a hill in 1560. 25,000 battle-hardened samurai are marching directly toward your home. You have 4,000? Every rational calculation, every advisor, every ounce of common sense says the same thing. Submit, bow, survive to fight another day. But Oda Nobunaga did not calculate. He didn't hold a war council. He didn't draft an alliance. Instead, he stood up, alone in his castle, and performed a traditional samurai dance, a prayer about the fleeting, phantom nature of human life. Then, he walked out of the gates and rode directly into a blinding, violent summer thunderstorm. While the enemy army huddled under their camps to shelter from the downpour, Nobunaga used the howling wind to mask his footsteps. He didn't fight a war of attrition. He launched a vertical lightning strike directly at the enemy commander's throat at Okehazama. The bird wouldn't sing, and Nobunaga's answer was simple. Move with absolute velocity and decisiveness when everyone else is paralyzed by fear. But velocity only works if you have weapons. What if you have nothing but dirt and a bad reputation? Enter Tsunomata, an impossible swampy riverbank in the heart of enemy territory. Nobunaga needed a fortress built there to anchor his campaign. Two of his most seasoned, prideful generals had already tried to build it. Both were slaughtered before the foundations could even dry. When two of his most seasoned generals had already died trying, Nobunaga needed someone willing to attempt the impossible again. Every capable man in the room looked away. Every man except one. A nameless, low-born peasant who cleaned his sandals. A man named Hideyoshi. Nobunaga saw someone expendable. He had no idea that this supposed death sentence would unleash the very man who would one day steal Japan from his own bloodline. Hideyoshi didn't march an army into the swamp to die for pride. He used a completely different alchemy. He batch manufactured the components of a castle miles away, floated the timber down the river under the cover of night, and assembled it like a puzzle overnight, under the cover of a heavy storm. When the enemy woke up and looked across the river, they didn't see a construction site. They saw an impregnable fortress standing where just mud had been the day before. They panicked. They retreated. The fort wasn't even structurally sound yet. It was a Hollywood set made of thin wood. But it didn't matter. The illusion of power is power. The bird wouldn't sing. Hideyoshi's answer: seduce them into believing it already is. Then there is the third man, the one who possessed neither the blinding flash of Nobunaga nor the brilliant persuasion of Hideyoshi. Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1573, the legendary Takeda Shingen marched 30,000 troops directly into Ieyasu's home territory. Nobunaga sent a small wave of reinforcements to help, but every seasoned advisor gave Ieyasu the same counsel: stay behind your walls. Do not engage. But Ieyasu, choked by his own pride, refused to hide. He marched his outnumbered men out onto the snowy plains of Mikitagahara and walked straight into a tactical slaughter. It wasn't a retreat. It was an annihilation. Ieyasu fled the field with a handful of guards, so utterly paralyzed by fear that legend says he soiled his own saddle as he rode for his life. When he finally collapsed behind his own castle walls, he didn't try to hide his shame. He didn't execute the witnesses. Instead, he immediately summoned a painter to his quarters. He commanded the artist to capture his face exactly as it looked in that moment. Broken, terrified, and humiliated. He hung that portrait on his wall. He looked at it every single day for the rest of his life. The bird wouldn't sing. Ieyasu's answer wasn't to fight or trick the obstacle. It was to let it completely break his ego so he could use the scar as a permanent compass. 3 men. Same impossible scenario. 3 different approaches. The cuckoo is still completely silent. None of them have solved the riddle of Japan yet. But the arena is set. Survival is only the first step. True dominion requires a different kind of ruthlessness. The bird was still silent. But the men asking it to sing were no longer the same men who started. When you are finally standing at the absolute height of your power, how do you systematically dismantle the pockets of reality that still refuse to bend to your will? By 1571, Nobunaga was no longer an underdog. He was the most feared warlord in the realm. But a massive problem stood in his way. Mount Hiei, a sacred mountain fortress defended by thousands of warrior monks. For centuries, these monks were considered untouchable, protected by divine law. They routinely sheltered Nobunaga's bitterest enemies, confident that no samurai would dare risk eternal damnation by attacking them. Nobunaga didn't care about damnation. He surrounded the entire mountain with 30,000 men. His instructions were absolute. Burn everything. Kill everyone. By nightfall, the ancient temples were ash. Every single man, woman, and child on that mountain, over 4,000 souls, lay dead. His own generals openly wept, begging him to stop, warning him that the gods would curse his bloodline. Nobunaga's response? He took the literal title, the Demon King of the 3 Skies, and carved it into his personal seal. The bird won't sing. His answer? Obliterate anything that dares to remain silent. When Nobunaga died, Hideyoshi inherited the realm. But he knew he couldn't rule with fire alone. Fire creates martyrs. Hideyoshi preferred a far cleaner alchemy, economic warfare. When he laid siege to the legendary Tottori Castle, he didn't launch a single arrow. He didn't lose a single soldier. Instead, before his army even arrived, he quietly sent undercover agents to buy every single grain of rice in the entire region at double the market price. The locals, blinded by greed, happily emptied their granaries. When Hideyoshi finally slammed the gates shut around Tottori Castle, the fortress had only a few weeks of food. The siege became a psychological horror story. Inside, men resorted to eating grass, then leather, and eventually, each other. The fortress surrendered without Hideyoshi ever drawing a sword. Immediately after, he enacted the Great Sword Hunt, disarming the entire civilian population by promising to melt their weapons into a giant statue of Buddha. He took their fangs and gave them a religion. The bird won't sing. Hideyoshi's answer: don't kill it. Make it entirely dependent on you for survival. By 1614, Tokugawa Ieyasu was on the cusp of victory, but he had a massive problem. Osaka Castle, the most heavily fortified position in the history of Japan, packed with 100,000 desperate ronin who refused to accept his rule. Ieyasu was running out of time, and brute force was failing. So Ieyasu stopped acting like a warlord and started acting like a machine. He purchased massive, state-of-the-art European artillery. He didn't aim them at the fortress walls. He aimed them directly at the private quarters, including where Yodo Dono, the fierce matriarch guiding the enemy clan, was staying. Day and night, the cannons screamed, shattering her psychological composure until she begged for a ceasefire. Ieyasu smiled and offered a generous peace treaty. He swore on his honor he would leave them in peace, on one tiny condition. They would let his men fill the castle's outer defensive moats as a gesture of goodwill. The enemy agreed. But the machine has no brakes. Ieyasu's men didn't just fill the outer moats. They kept shoveling. They filled the middle moats. They filled the inner moats. Within days, the most impregnable fortress in the empire was stripped completely naked. It was no longer a castle. It was just a building standing in a flat dirt field. The bird won't sing. Ieyasu's answer: quietly dismantle the landscape until it has nowhere left to hide. Fire, starvation, deception. 3 completely different instruments of absolute control. The cuckoo is still silent, but the cage is getting terrifyingly small. So what does each philosophy cost when the final bill finally arrives? Oda Nobunaga's absolute velocity made him the master of Japan, but his terror created a lethal blind spot. He could see every enemy on the battlefield, but he could not see the man bowing lowest to him in his own court. Akechi Mitsuhide, a highly cultured, deeply prideful general who had endured years of public humiliation and psychological torment under Nobunaga's iron fist. Mitsuhide watched, waited, and stayed silent until June 21st, 1582. Nobunaga was staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only 30 personal attendants. Mitsuhide struck with 13,000 men. There was no escape. Surrounded by walls of roaring flame, Nobunaga realized his absolute rule had isolated him completely. He committed seppuku as the temple collapsed around him. He killed every bird that wouldn't sing, and never noticed the one that had been watching him from inside the cage. The cuckoo never sang for Oda Nobunaga. Hideyoshi won Japan through brilliant illusion and charm. He made the country sing briefly during a golden summer of peace. But the intense hunger that drove a barefoot peasant boy to conquer an empire cannot simply be turned off. When there was nothing left to conquer in Japan, the hunger turned into absolute madness. He launched a delusional, catastrophic invasion of Korea, dragging 100,000 samurai into a frozen meat grinder of a war that nobody wanted and nobody could win. In 1598, Hideyoshi lay dying in his golden palace. His mind was fractured, obsessed with the survival of his fragile 5-year-old heir, Hideyori. He spent his final breaths begging his generals to swear oaths of loyalty to his son, passing around gold to buy their souls. But you cannot buy loyalty from wolves. The second his chest stopped moving, his grand empire, built on illusion and gold leaf, evaporated into thin air. He seduced the bird. But seduction is not ownership. The cuckoo sang exactly once for Hideyoshi, and he spent the rest of his life slowly going mad, trying to hear it again. Then, there is Tokugawa Ieyasu. To build a machine that could outlast the chaos of Japan, Ieyasu had to systematically strip away every shred of his own humanity. When Oda Nobunaga demanded it to prove his absolute compliance, Ieyasu did not negotiate. He ordered his own firstborn son to commit seppuku and gave the command to execute his own wife. He didn't just lose them to the casual tragedy of war. He signed their death warrants himself, prioritizing the cold gears of his long-term survival over his own blood. For 40 years, he buried that grief, swallowed every public insult from Hideyoshi, and waited. In 1616, at the age of 73, Ieyasu sat alone in a freezing room. Nobunaga was long dead. Hideyoshi's lineage had been completely wiped from the earth by Ieyasu's own hand. The empire was unified, peaceful, and entirely his. The bird was finally singing, but there was no one left in the room to hear it with him. He had outlived his enemies, outlived his friends, and executed his own blood to keep the machine running. He had become so cold, so detached, that the song didn't even matter anymore. He waited. The bird sang. But the room was completely empty. The cuckoo sang exactly once for each man. At the exact moment, each one paid his final, devastating price. The song and the cost arrived together. 3 answers. 1 bird, 1 Japan. The destroyer cleared the rubble. The alchemist paved it. The machine inherited it. But here is the truth that none of them understood until the sand had fully run out. The cuckoo was never the point. The point was what each man was forced to become in order to make it sing. Nobunaga became the demon king. Hideyoshi became the desire that could never be fed. Ieyasu became the ultimate machinery. Japan was unified. The bird sang. 3 men paid everything they had. The question this story leaves, the one it cannot answer for you. Which price would you have paid? The machine didn't just inherit Japan. It became the shadow behind every throne that followed. You may know what he built, but do you know what it cost him to become it?